Thank you very much for this invitation and for the nice introduction here. It's really a pleasure to be here. Already saw a lot of things and pretty impressed what you all have here. It's really nice. Okay, I want to talk today to you about some of the work, basically give you an overview of the work that we've done over the last 10 years or so. So it's more a big picture talk that I want to give you. And all of that is around multisensory perception and action. And the question is how, since you have multiple senses, how do you put the information together? But we put this information together for one purpose, namely that's why we have a brain. We have a brain in order to interact with the world, not to sit comfortably in front of a television and get passive information, but we want to use that information that we get through the senses in order to allow us interaction. So that's what we are interested in, is this sensory motor loop, basically. And this box here is supposedly the brain, and I want to model a little bit what we think is going on in the brain in order to make sense of this sensory information that is out there, allowing us to interact. So I'll start with work that we have done 10 years ago when I was in Berkeley, actually, looking at the integration of visual and haptic information. But first of all, I want to show you a few demos on multisensory processing so they get a flair. I was told that there's quite a mixed audience here. Not all are from the perception side. So who has heard of the McGurk effect? Quite a number, but not all. Okay, that's good. Then I can show it. So what I'll show to you is now first a little sound file. And you tell me whether you hear a ga. Does anyone hear a ga? Does anyone hear a da? Does anyone hear a ba? Good. All good. You can realize you're in the Sound Institute here. Okay, so if you look at him now, the percept should have changed from the da-da to a ba-ba. From the ba-ba to a da-da, sorry. Mixing it up. So what is happening here? Well, what you heard, of course, without the vision was correct, was a ba-ba. What the lips are doing is a ga-ga. And what your brain is doing is putting both sorts of information together, combines them in a way, and gets up with a da-da. You can show that actually physically there's a uniform or there's a unique a linear dimension underlying it. So if I play these sounds, you hear ba, 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 da, 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 da. So it basically goes from a b to a d to a g. And the only thing that changes is the frequency content here continuously. So what the brain basically is doing is coming up with something in between the ba and the ga, so physical. Another demo that I want to show you, I've showed it on Tuesday already, but for those who haven't been there, that's probably new. What you should do is fixate here, and I'll play you a little file over there. Let me try to make it a little louder. Okay. I guess everyone has seen one event happening. Yes? Anyone seen two? Good. Okay, let's look here again. Anyone seen two now? No? A couple, half or something like that. Nodding. Actually, what is happening again is, of course, if I played it again without sound, here there was one event, and here there was one event as well, visually. But since the auditory events, there were two played, what your brain is doing, putting that together, that doesn't always work so good in this big audience that you've seen. So probably if I do this here, half of the people see, then two, half not. That depends on the speed of the projector and stuff like that, how well this works. If you do this in a laboratory environment where everything is dark around, you probably put it even more in the periphery, that works better. Everyone will see two events when you have two auditory events and one visual event. So you have a complete bias of the visual, what you see from the auditory event. And there are other examples from vision and touch where you get similar biases. I can't demo that here for you, so you have to believe me. So the first one reported by Rock and Victor, what they have done is they had subjects look through a distortion lens onto an object which they could feel behind a glove. And this distortion lens made this look like a rectangle. It felt like a square. And then they asked people many questions of what they perceived. Well, they either did it visually alone, they did it haptically alone, or in the combined case with the conflict through the distortion lens, they asked them to draw what they perceive. They gave them a range of objects and they should pick out whatever they perceive, or a range of haptic objects, so they should feel whatever they perceive in this case. Here they report the aspect ratio. So if you have the visual one, physically I think this is 2, so 1.9 is pretty close to veridical. Physically this one here is 1, so the percept again is pretty close to veridical. If you look at the conflict case, what people report is pretty much what the visual modality tells you, but slightly in between. If we do here, now they report millimeters, and that was, I think it's 12 millimeters and 24, it's close to vertical. Again, the combined case is relatively close to the visual one. Probably the more interesting test is now if you do it haptically. The question is, do we now go with the haptic information and not with the visual information? But no, what is happening is, again, you go with the visual information. So what was after these studies, there's a couple of more in this direction. It was believed that it's the visual modality that basically captures everything and is the gold standard, so we take that. But in a way, of course, it doesn't really make sense that once you've collected all information that you would throw away one part of the information, one modality, forget it, and listen only to one modality. So we are thinking of what would actually be the ideal way of how you should combine sources of information from different sensory modality. So we basically redid this Rock and Victor study. We've been doing that 30 years later, so the technology advanced a little bit since then. I guess many of you have seen here or heard about these little robotic devices that are called Phantom. Those are producing forces on the fingers, so you can simulate objects that you can grasp. We have the visual image portrayed here on the CRT. You look at it through a mirror, so we can disentangle what you see and what you feel, and we can introduce these conflicts, play with these conflicts, and people are unaware of these, that these conflicts will be happening, which is quite important if you want to systematically introduce or study the integration process. Just quickly how that looks like, a movie from 15 or 12 years ago when I was just a PhD student. That's where we first acquired these devices and did the first study in this direction. It's driven by 3 motors, so the principle is very simple. It has a position sensor in there, and whenever you come to the virtual wall, then the motors block, so you can't go any further. And with this principle, if you take it seriously and model the physics correctly, you can even model dynamic objects that you can throw around, as you will see in a second that I'm doing here. Here, picking up some cubes and playing around with that. Okay, with this we can also precisely control when you feel something and how long you feel something. And we can measure entire psychometric functions. Okay, but so far to the technology, here you see a cube moving around. So the question, coming back to the Rock and Victor study, or in general to multisensory integration, the question we ask is what would be the optimal way to integrate information? So there's one problem. Like any technical system, also human perception isn't perfect. If you process information through the neural system, which is pretty crappy, there's noise on it. So you can't be perfect with this. That is indicated here by this Gaussian distribution. So you have 2 sources of information, C1 and C2, both of which are noisy, indicated by this Gaussian distribution. And the width of this distribution gives you a measure of how reliable or how good the quality of the information is that you're having. We define reliability as the inverse of the variance, so 1 divided by sigma squared. And then you can show mathematically, given that these sources are independent and Gaussian and so on, that the optimal way to combine the information is to do a weighted sum, a simple weighted sum, where the weights are proportional to these reliabilities. So in words, what that means is you should take both sources of information and trust more the one that has less variance. You can see here. So this one here has less variance, has less width. So you can trust it more, so the percept is closer to this one than to that one. Now if I add noise to Q1, make this wider and wider, then the weight moves gradually over to C2. And that's exactly the experiment we wanted to do, test whether we add noise to one sensory modality, you lose trust in it, and it gets reweighted to the other modality. Why we say this is optimal? Because you can show mathematically that this combined estimate is better than each individual alone, and has the smallest variance possible that you can get of an unbiased estimator. Okay, we call this an ideal observer approach because that's the ideal that you can do. Okay, so the test is pretty straightforward. In principle, exactly what Rock and Victor did. We created a conflict in this virtual apparatus that we had here. So for example, the visual information was 60 millimeters, the haptic information was 50 millimeters. And then we did simple comparison, similar like they're matching, but we did it systematically. And then you measure so-called psychometric functions by doing comparisons between those. And there's only 2 points that are critical. Well, you do comparison, and basically, I'm not going through the methods in all detail if you haven't looked into psychometric function before. But the points that are critical is that this is a point, so-called a point of subjective equality. This is when this conflicting stimulus matches in percept to the size of a non-conflicting stimulus. So basically, that's the size of this conflicting that you perceive. The other variable that is critical is the slope of this, or what we call the just noticeable difference, the JND. And this function you can model as a cumulative Gaussian function, and that's directly basically the integral of a Gaussian. So the peak, the PSE, corresponds to the peak of this distribution, whereas the width of this corresponds to the JND. So this way we know how good a sensory estimate is, and we know what they are estimating. Okay, so this first psychometric function that you see here is basically replicating what Rock and Victor found, namely a dominance of the visual modality. What people perceive, the PSE, is very close to the visual estimate. Now what happens if we add noise? We add a little bit of noise, we add more noise, and we add even more noise. What you can see is that the curve gradually shifts over to the haptic estimate. So at least qualitatively, that already matches pretty good what the model would predict. But we can make this quantitatively because you can measure each sensory modality alone. You can measure what the haptic information tells you. You can measure what the visual information tells you. Then you have estimates of these sigmas that go into these weights. And then you can look what these weights are or what they should be. And they should be here. And they're pretty close to what we've measured. Similarly, we have a model of what the JNDs should be, because the JND, as I said, is proportional to the variance. That's simply, according to this formula, we can also put this in, and you can see that the predictions that we have here pretty much are spot on to what we've measured empirically. So from this, we could conclude then that humans really are integrating visual and haptic information in a statistical optimal way, as we call it. Namely, you get a weighted summation in order to reduce the variance. That's the thing to do. Okay. By now, there have been many studies for different things, like for tree model things. If you knock somewhere, you get haptic information, you get visual and auditory information. All of them are integrated in a similar way that I've shown here. In the talk on Tuesday that I gave here, we did the same thing on temporal estimates, and it works exactly the same way. If you estimate duration of a tone, for example, and you see someone playing something, also the length of a duration signal will be integrated in a similar way as shown here. Okay, but of course at some point, if I were to make this conflict larger and larger, integration must break down. It wouldn't make sense to take the size of this one and the size of Michael and integrate it into one big, whatever, average-sized Michael. So there must be some breakdown. So we must do something before you integrate information, namely to see whether it belongs to one and the same object. And that's an experiment that we have done as well. So we've created conflicts between visual and haptic objects, similar experiment as before. We've played them either from the same location, like here, synchronous, or we played them offset. So you looked at an object over here, and what you felt was slightly to the right or to the left. And what is happening then, that you gradually find a fall off of the integration process over time. But the human brain is not so stupid, because that would simply mean it looks at the proximity. We can look at the proximity in space. We can look at the proximity in time. So if things occur synchronous in time, basically that's also a signal to integrate information. That's happening as well. But it's not just looking at spatial temporal synchrony. It can do more. And that's what we've asked here, namely, what is if the brain has some reason to believe, even so there may be a spatial conflict, that that is still from the same source of information? Would you then still integrate? And the way we did this is by simply placing a mirror here. So suddenly you looked at your hand, well, far away, basically. There was a huge spatial conflict. But if you know about mirrors, well, you would still think that when you knock here, well, that's me and I should integrate the information. That's exactly the experiment that we have done then. And we took basically this Rock and Victor apparatus and the same design that they've used. So people looked through a distortion lens, so the object felt like this rectangle. It looked like a square here, 40 by 40. And if you have people looking directly onto it, similar like Rock and Victor have done that, then you can ask them what I've shown you, either visually or haptically. It doesn't really matter which way you do the experiment. You will find something in between. It's not 40, what vision tells you. It's not 20, what haptic tells you. It's something in between. So you have integration. This integration, as I've shown you, will easily break down. If I put the visual object over here and you will look at this visual object while you're feeling this, then you can ask for the visual one, you get the visual response. You can ask for the haptic one, you get the haptic response. You get a nice breakdown of integration. But if we do the same spatial configuration as here, but via a mirror, you see that integration is back. So the brain is pretty clever in figuring out the correspondence between signals. When it believes that two signals belong together, it starts integrating those. Okay. So much I want to say about integration process. We have done several studies, and I'll just review some of them what we've did. So basically we started off looking at optimal integration, what I've shown you, that you find integration for spatial cues, but also for temporal cues. I've shown you here that fusion has to break down with large conflicts, but it can be promoted through causal inference, like this mirror setup. What I haven't shown you is the other two studies, namely that integration seems to be a very automatic process. We've tried to play with attention, put attention on one modality on the other. It seems to have almost no effect on the integration process. So it seems something really, really low level and automatic that is going on. So you cannot easily ignore something. So I was yesterday listening to a demo here of some sound image, nice rendering. And to me, at least, it felt, if I opened my eyes and had a real room there, it felt completely different when I closed my eyes, because when I have my real room and the sound image, you get some integration processes going on, whereas if you close your eyes, you can basically hear the clear audio image and can ignore one information source. Okay, what I haven't shown you here, but I'll give you some more examples, but not in the integration domain, is that there's quite some plasticity going on. So there's learning. If I put you in an environment where suddenly there's two cues which are normally not integrated, like the stiffness of an object and its luminance, they have nothing to do with each other, you wouldn't integrate them. But I can artificially put you in an environment where they are correlated over time. So you play with objects that are hard and bright or dark and soft. After only an hour of training, you will use that and integrate. So the brain makes use of all correlation that it finds in the world in order to make best use of all the information that is there, and that in a relatively short time. And I'll show you this in another experiment that we have done, but not on sensory information, but on the next topic. Oh, I forgot to go through here. Okay. Namely, so far we have looked at the processing of sensory information. We can describe this as a probabilistic process because of the noise in the signal. And I'm not going into mathematics here, but basically you can write this as a probability distribution. But we've lived in this world already for quite some time. So we've acquired knowledge. And also this knowledge we can describe in a probability function. And if we have two probability functions, the way to optimally combine prior knowledge with sensory information is via Bayes' theorem in a probabilistic way. which is shown here. But again, before I go into the mathematics, I want to show you just some examples of where prior knowledge has an effect on perception, just as demos. I think they're more intuitive than that. It's in German, but it doesn't matter what they're saying. It's a little dark here, but I guess you got the idea. And I guess all of you have had this illusion already that you're sitting in a train, suddenly the train next to you starts moving and you have the impression it's you moving. The reason why that is happening is that, well, visual information is ambiguous. It can be you moving, it can be the other source moving, so you don't know. The brain has to, in order to disambiguate that, rely on prior knowledge, has to know. And normally, if we look around, the world around us is pretty stationary. What we are doing, we are moving through the world. So we have a prior for that the world is stationary. It's called a stationary world prior, and therefore we disambiguate this situation. In this case, if we have no other information, that, well, it must be us moving, not this train out there. Here's another example of a rotating face mask, and it's always hollow that it turns around. And if you haven't seen that, well, what we are having, the world we are surrounded with is pretty much convex. The objects. If you statistically look around, they're convex, and particularly faces. We very rarely experience hollow faces. So we have a hard time seeing that as a hollow face. If it turns around, immediately it flips to be a real face again, a convex face again sticking out. And the third example I'm giving you is this one here. I guess everyone will see this here as a hill sticking out. Does anyone see it as a crater? As a crater, yeah? Should you turn your head up? Okay, and this one as a crater. In truth, of course, it's twice exactly the same image, just turned upside down. In order to interpret, again, this ambiguous information is that, well, I have to know where the light is coming from. If I know where the light is coming from, and I make an assumption about where the light is coming from, namely from above, normally light is coming from above, like here in this room, the sun is above and so on. If I make that assumption here, light is coming from above, well, this must go out. If the light is coming from above here, well, this must go in. That's pretty well known and studied quite extensively in the literature. So what we were asking ourselves is, are these statistics something that we are born with, basically we are given genetically, or is it something we can adapt through experience with the world? And again, we used a similar setup as before. Namely, we could ask people to feel objects. And we measured this light from above prior, and then we shifted it. We shifted basically virtually the world by 30, or the light in the world by 30 degrees. And then we looked whether people would adapt to that. And in order to learn, of course, they have to feel it. So we did, the design was they measured in the pre-test what this light assumption is. We then did a training session with shifted light, and then we measured in a post-test whether anything has happened to your percept. Okay, here's data for one subject. It's shown here in this polar plot. So if light is, if it's bright on above, it's 0 degree. Bright from below, it's 180. Bright from the left, it's 90 and 270. What we plot here in blue is the person's answers that they've seen it sticking out, convex. And you can see that if the light is basically coming from above, she's always seeing sticking it out. Somewhere when the light is coming from the side, that's when it flips to be concave. So the white area would, when she said it is concave. So now we took this and trained them with haptic feedback with 30 degree shifted light. So here we now have situations where she was perceiving it as concave, but now she's feeling it convex, and the reverse here. So that over time, again an hour roughly of training. And then we looked in the post-test what is happening. And this is her percept afterwards. And that was 4. So really within an hour training, again, we have internalized these statistics, we use them, and in a perceptual experiment. So we can pretty quickly adapt to new situations. We had to do a control experiment here because it could still be one of two explanations of why people adopted here. The one would be what we wanted, namely that they've learned the light source assumption, that it's shifted. Alternatively, what they've always seen, whatever, when it was bright here on the side, it was sticking out. So they could simply have learned this mapping without telling me anything about the percept. Whenever it was light here in the bright test, it would say, okay, I've just learned that it's sticking out, no matter what I perceive this visual thing to be. So in order to control for that, we needed to do a transfer task. So we had to learn with a stimulus that people, or learn with this one here, but test with a completely different stimulus where that doesn't play a role. But of course, the stimulus should also be susceptible to this light from above prior. And the stimulus that we came up with looks like this. It's basically a roof that you see sticking out here. It's uniquely convex. Convex. That's why we put a stick through here. And we asked subject to compare these gray sides of the roof. They are physically identical. You will probably see this one here is darker than this one here. And the reason is because this is pointing to the light. If they are physically identical, but the one pointing to the light must therefore be darker for your brain interpreted. That it really works, this kind of illusion, I can show here by a famous illusion of Ted Adelson. If you look at A and B, you would probably see this is brighter than this one. But actually, if I take away the shadow or the context, they're exactly the same. And that's basically the same with my light from above prior that I've shown you here. Is this one here is in the shadow, this is in the sun, this is in the shadow, therefore this one looks darker than this one here. And that's exactly the here. This is in the sun, therefore it looks darker than this one here. Okay, but now we can turn this thing around relative to where the sun is. If it's perpendicular to the sun, then it would have no effect. They should be equally bright and perceived. If it's like this, they should have an effect. So by rotating it around, I basically can map out where you perceive the sun to be. If I do this, well, the training again with this stimulus, mapping where the sun is pre and post with this. And what you find, we had two groups of subjects, and I probably weren't here to tell you this if it wouldn't work. We have the people who were rotated with the light in the negative direction by 30 degrees. Within an hour, they learned pretty much the half of that. And then the people who've learned in the other direction that. So this contrast between this group tells you that people are really adopting the light from above prior within only an hour of training. Okay, this led us then to conclude that it's, this interaction, this experience we have with the world, with the statistics of the world, which gets immediately internalized in a very quick way, actually, and used for perception. So it changes our perception in just a short time. There are reports in the literature that humans behave slightly different from chickens because chickens couldn't learn that. So it seems like we are a little bit more adaptable than chickens are. But yeah, what we learned are the statistics, and we transferred it to other situations. That's work done with Wendy Adams and Erich Graf. Okay, so far, what I wanted to tell you about that we combine sensory information, we combine that with the knowledge that we have about the world. We make probabilistically the best estimate, the best guess what is out there in the world using these two sources of information. But now, of course, we have to use that for something. We have to close that loop, namely to perform some action. And if you perform some action, any action that you do, there's something to win and something to lose. So in a probabilistic framework, you describe that with a gain or loss function. May it be whatever, if I point somewhere, I want to point somewhere accurately to hit whatever the light bulb. If I'm wrong, that's bad because the light doesn't go on. So you want to be, one of the things here is you want to be as accurate as possible in this light function. Okay, so, and that's exactly the next experiment I want to show you, and is in terms of learning to reduce the biases that you have in the perception. We can again do this experimentally. And again, this is a study which is based on some history going back for quite some time. Namely, the first studies in this direction have been done by Hermann von Helmholtz, who has done the first prism adaptation studies. Prism adaptation studies, if you don't know that, is you basically, well, I'll show you in a second. You put on a pair of prism which will shift the world. That's similar like you, if most of us have glasses. If you come from the doctor, eye doctor the first time with new glasses, new prescription, you feel a little dizzy. And that is not because you see better, but because, of course, there are geometric distortions that the glasses make. But the brain very quickly adapts to these geometric distortions and learns to compensate for them. So learns a new mapping between what it sees and how it has to react to the world. There have been many studies on this prism adaptation, and they look something like this. So your task is to point here to this target, and you can do this quite well. But if you do this repeatedly, you'll find that you're not perfect. Like always, you have sensory motor noise in there. It may look something like this in a cartoonish fashion. And then people become these nice prisms which shift the world, and now the world is over here for them. And of course, they have to point there at first. And then they realize, oops, I've made a mistake. I didn't land on target where it really is. And then over trials, they learn. And actually, it's almost as fast as this. If you have a simple remapping of only a linear shift, within like 5 to 10 trials, you're back to normal. And that doesn't matter how old you are, you learn pretty quickly. The characteristic of this learning is that if you take away these prisms, that you find a negative after effect. People point in the opposite direction. That's really telling you that something has changed again in your brain within only a couple of trials of pointing. Because, well, why is it telling you? Because you know, basically, you're taking off the prism, so you know that you're in the world where you've lived the last 30, 40, 50 years of your life. So if it's a cognitive thing, then it should immediately go back to where it is, but you can't basically, you can't go other than finding this negative after effect. Okay, but also this goes away relatively quickly. So basically what the brain is learning here is a new mapping every time. A new mapping, and depending on how complex this mapping is, that can be sometimes fast or sometimes slow. So this is the characteristic of such a learning curve. So you measure the baseline, put the prisms on, find the adaptation curve, put the prisms away, find a negative after effect. If you have complicated prescription, means you have to learn a relatively complicated mapping. Of course, will take longer than if you have a simple shift. In the simple shift, it's like roughly 10 trials, as I said. But you find this again, it's a very universal. I'll show you this in the sensory motor domain, but it's again across all sensory modalities. You can play the same trick in whatever, between vision and audition. So you can, with these prisms, of course, the visual world is shifted relative to the auditory world, and you can show that you find recalibration effects in the same way as you do here in the motor domain. You can play this even within a sensory modality by, for example, if I put a magnifier in front of one eye only, this messes up my stereo vision from the two eyes. But it doesn't mess up all the other cues that we have to depth, for example, perspective. You can show that here the learning takes place as well, similar like here, but it takes about, whatever, a week to 2 weeks to adapt. So this time course is massively different depending on, yeah, exactly, that was the question, depending on what. So what we wanted to look at is what determines this time course of learning. If we find in all sensory modalities, we want to know why you're sometimes learning new mappings quickly and why you're learning sometimes new mappings or to adapt to other mappings in a slow fashion. In order to get at that, well, we have to look again at the problem that the brain faces in order to do this. So imagine you've just been here, you wanted to point here, but you ended up there. So you realize that you have made an error. Now, of course, the question that the brain has to ask itself is, what is the cause for this error? Where does this error come from? Well, there are two possibilities in principle. One is that it really had the wrong model somehow. It wanted to be there, it ended up there. For example, I had a weight on my arm which prevented it to go there. Or I had these prisms on. Or my muscles were just tired and I couldn't go there. All of that would introduce systematic errors because I have a wrong model of the world. If I had systematic errors, of course, I should adapt in the next trial. But the problem is not that simple because it could also have the cause that I did a wrong measurement. As I've shown you that there's sensory noise in the system, I will always make errors in measuring this error that I have here. I will always have uncertainty in the measurement. This measurement noise is random. From trial to trial, it will be different. If it's different from trial to trial, well, you don't want to react to it. You don't want to change your system because the next trial will be different. So now you have two possibilities. In one you want to change, in this you don't want to change. Both of these are uncertain again. There's uncertainty indicated by this Gaussian distribution. Well, what should you do? If you have two possibilities, both are uncertain, exactly the same as in the integration process, you take a weighted average of those. And this is basically giving you the optimal estimate of the current bias. And we can reformulate that slightly, and then it's a more engineering formulation of this problem, which is known, well, it's a simple version of a Kalman filter if you do this iteratively here. Okay, and in this Kalman filter, there's a Kalman gain, and this Kalman gain basically determines how quickly you are learning or how quickly you're following something. And this Kalman gain has both these noise sources in there, or these uncertainties in there from the model, from the process noise, and the measurement noise. And that's now an experiment that we want to do, is we want to measure, or we want to manipulate experimentally these two noise sources and see whether they have this effect that we predict from this model here on the learning rate. Okay, again, not to go into the mathematics too deeply, I want to show you intuitively what should happen if I add noise on the either or the other side. For this, imagine that you've pointed here for quite some time, so the next target comes up, you plan your motor movement, well, it's exactly as the ones before because you don't think that anything has changed. Then you get your measurement in, both of these estimates are uncertain, and you do this weighted average as I've shown here. Now, if we add noise to your measurements by, for example, putting on blurring filters in front of your eyes, so you can't see very well that you've made an error. If you do this, well, you can make the same feed-forward prediction, but now your error estimate that you're getting is more uncertain, so you trust it less. If you trust it less, you correct less on that trial, which means you adapt slowly. Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward prediction. If you basically can't see that you've made an error, or if you have a hard time seeing you made an error, you should adapt more slowly. So we did this experiment. People were sitting, in this case, in a large back projection screen. They weren't seeing their fingers when they were pointing, but we did it, they had to point on a graphics tablet, and then feedback came up on the screen, and this feedback could either be crisp and a small Gaussian blob of 4 degrees, which is about that size. That's relatively easy to localize. We can measure that psychophysically as well. Or it could be larger and larger, up to 48 degrees, which is a blob of about that size, which is really hard to localize. And as you can see here is that the learning rate in the 4-degree case, this one here, is pretty fast, and in the high noise case here is very slow, exactly as predicted. We find the same thing in the after effect, but it's now hard to say, especially since the colors are bad here. So the blue curve ends up here, so they start from here, learning back, and the green one ends up here, so they start from here, going back more slowly. So this first prediction at least is correct. Probably the more surprising one, or the more interesting case, is how can we model the uncertainty in the feed-forward model that you're having? Well, basically we can put you in a world where you have a hard time making a prediction. And a world where you can make a hard prediction is a world that is constantly changing. So that would correspond to a world where every trial you point, I put your new prism glasses on the eye. But you keep on your old ones. What you have then is basically a random walk that you're getting here, if this is that you're getting on. Now you can make still a feed-forward prediction, what should happen, but of course this has much more uncertainty here now. Now if you have your measurement, you will trust that more, which would mean that you should learn faster. So if you're living in a world that's more uncertain, you should follow your measurements more fast, and therefore you should learn more quickly. That's the experiment we did for this. That's a world that was relatively stable, only 4 degrees of random walk noise, and that's the learning curve that we have to that. If we put you in a world that's more variable, after a short time, only after 50 trials being in a world like that, your adaptation profile becomes faster. So people very quickly, again, learn these statistics, and they use it, in this case here, to learn more quickly. Okay, so it seems like this adaptation rate depends on the reliability or the quality of the visual feedback. If that's unreliable, there's a slow adaptation. The adaptation rate also depends on the uncertainty of predicting the world. So your feed-forward model, if that's uncertain, you get a faster adaptation. So at least to a first approximation, such a simple Kalman filter model as an ideal observer model is a relatively good predictor for human pointing or adaptation rate here. So how quickly you do a remapping. I say to a first approximation because the brain, of course, has a much harder problem than this Kalman filter, namely it has to estimate its noise sources itself. This Kalman filter is usually given the noises. The human has to estimate how noisy is the sensory information that you're having, how noisy is my whatever prediction that I have of the world. And apparently it learns that relatively quickly within 50 trials, but how exactly that is done and why it can learn that so quickly or how it's learning that so quickly is still pretty much unknown. Okay, so these were all relatively laboratory conditions so far. So we want to do some studies a little bit more ecologically valid and go into the real world and see whether adaptation processes like this occur also in the real world setting, which we would predict should, because conflicts also naturally arise maybe. But before I go and answer this question, I basically want to tell you this story, the next story, the way it actually happened. Basically, it didn't happen for this reason to study this, namely it started all off, and here Ilya was involved, who's sitting in the audience. It started all off with a TV team that came to us with the question, it's something like Mythbusters that you have here probably. I don't know what you have, something equivalent here in Canada, I guess, like Mythbusters or so? No? Yeah, where the TV shows come to you, they ask you some questions, and then you as a scientist should give a clever answer. So they came to us with this question whether if it's true if people are lost in the desert that they start running in circle, and if so, of course, why that is happening. And at that time we just started to do some locomotion studies, but we thought, well, it's easy, we just look in the literature, we give them the answer. And well, if you look in the popular literature, you find many things about that, namely in Mark Twain, in Leo Tolstoy, in whatever, Laurel and Hardy, Blair Witch Project, in Tintin, and so on. But in the scientific literature, there's basically nothing. There was one study in the 1928 or something like that who looked at that thing, but after that, basically nothing really. So we had to go back. They wanted to have a 2-minute show out of that. We said, sorry, we can't give you the answer. If you want the answer, we have to go and do the experiment. And they said, well, okay, let's go to the desert. So they flew us down in the desert, gave us a little bit more time than 2 minutes in the show in the end. They made actually a 45-minute show out of the whole thing in the end, which was quite nice. So yeah, we flew down to Sahara Desert here. The first thing that we noticed is actually quite difficult to find an environment where you can do such an experiment. Because even in the Sahara Desert, you usually find a palm tree in like 5-kilometer distance or something like that. And then, of course, this experiment is quite boring because you just orient yourself to this palm tree and you walk towards it, and then you never walk in a circle. So the first day we basically looked at an environment which had some sand dunes, but they were not high enough, so you're not too exhausted running around, but also you couldn't see the horizon all the time. And it took us a while to find this environment, but after a while we found it. And then the task was pretty straightforward and probably the most simple task that you can imagine. Namely, we told subject, here's the direction. You have 4 hours, go in this direction for the next 4 hours, as straight as possible. The only disadvantage was it was like 45 degrees here. And of course, people didn't have any navigational instruments. There was a person walking behind them just for safety and with a GPS to record the data. And here's the first data, what it looked like. Here's a person, KB, started off here in this direction. At the beginning, he made interesting turns. We were already excited already. But then, well, here he took a break and pretty much walked straight after that. Still, I guess it's not a good idea to try this in the desert, because if water were here, you would be dead as well. Okay, second person, we set out here in this direction. Pretty much straight, not perfectly straight, but yeah. And that was the third person. He wasn't drunk, but he was, that's not why he's blue, he was walking in the dark. And at the beginning, there was the moon visible, and suddenly there were clouds coming, and so as soon as the clouds come, he started to make a turn. So probably, as you can imagine, well, the sun may help in this environment to do that, and probably the moon as well. Unfortunately, we didn't have many more subjects there, and all these people were also not naive. They were all from the camera team, so it wasn't a real great scientific experiment. And the problem is the clouds here came because there was a sandstorm coming, and then even these locals, who thought we are crazy anyway, said we have to go out there. So we left the desert, and but since all these anecdotes are true not only in the desert but also in the jungle, we thought, at that time I was still in Tübingen, what is the closest jungle to Tübingen? And we found a little forest called the Bienenwald close to Karlsruhe, which has good properties for this experiment. Namely, it is relatively flat, the trees are not dense, and the underwoods are pretty much open so you can easily walk. But it's dense enough so you can't see more than 40, 50 meters or something like that. Other than that, the task was pretty much the same. Well, this time we recorded, since also it don't tell us, that it may have to do with the sun. So we looked whether it's cloudy or sunny. The rest was the same. Okay, and here's the first person walking on a cloudy day. And that's nice circles. And a few more, all walking on cloudy days, pretty much not straight. But then we had two people walking on a sunny day. And this one here had clouds at the beginning, so he made a little turn. But then the sun came out and he was pretty much straight. This one here even left the forest, so we turned him around and sent him back in. Probably interesting. Of course, if you use the sun moves, and depending on where you are on the globe and what time of the year is it, the sun moves more or less in 4 hours. This is the actual geographical data for where the sun would have been, or where the shadow would have been. And you can see actually if they're only oriented after the sun, they actually should have turned more than they do here. So they're using more information than just the sun to orient themselves. But of course, visual information is very important. And to get at the heart of what people are actually doing in the circling, you basically have to reduce vision altogether. So blindfold people and see what's happening then. Of course, the forest is not the best environment to do this. So we went out and looked at the island, and Ilya, since he's from Holland, he told us there's a nice island in Holland called Vlieland, which has a nice sand strip of 3 by 6 kilometers. So here you can let people run for quite some time. The only disadvantage in this environment is that the Dutch military is using that as a drop for testing bombs and stuff like that. So there's all these warning signs running around, and there's occasionally you find these little bombs lying around. But they guaranteed us it's safe and it's open to the public on the weekend. So well, we went there, nothing happened, luckily. Okay, then, well, again, the task as simple as you can think. This time we just put a black glove on the top of him and said, now go straight. And here's what she was doing. So this is now meters, so this is 100 meters. Here she started and immediately ran in circles. The diameter of this is down to 15 meters. So it almost fits in this room as a circle that they are doing. And they're thinking they are going straight. And that even so that on this island there are still some cues available that in principle you could use. For example, well, even so we put in earplugs, you can still hear something of the environment where the waves are. What is probably a better cue here is that the wind is constantly, of course, coming on this island, and it's usually coming from one side. This person was saying, oh, it's strange, the wind is turning today all the time. Okay, so what is going on here? So if I ask people, I guess, anyone an idea what is happening? The first idea that comes to mind? Yes?
Dominant side pushing you.
Right.
Asymmetries in your posture.
Good. Thanks for this answer. That's exactly the answer that you get always first. Which is good. And it's actually in the literature, in some of these reports about that you get lost, popular books of advice to people how they should orient if they're in the wilderness and so, and they report about this phenomenon as well and say also that it has to do with body asymmetry. There's one strong argument against that, and that's if you look at the statistics of these people. Namely, there are some people who are constantly walking in one direction, but most of the people actually they're going once in one direction and then in the other direction. And I don't assume that a leg is growing in 10 minutes, quite something. So basically, you find curvatures, and you find curvatures to the left, and you find curvatures to the right in one person all the time. And even this person KS that we have run here, he was one who was running in the forest in circles. Here he's constantly running to the left. In the forest he was constantly running to the right. So even extreme people like that, they don't have a systematic bias like that. So it can't really be anything to do with body asymmetry or something like that. To make this more clear, you can look at the statistics of all the people that we've measured. So there are some. So here's the direction change, or the curvature basically. Here's KS. He really has a drift, in this case, to the left all the time. There are some people to the right, but most people are sometimes going to the left, sometimes going to the right. On average, they're not allowed and go straight. So the statistics are going straight, and that's a nice normal distribution you have here. So it seems more like it's a noisy process that is going on. And that can be characterized. Here's basically, we had these people start at 0, 0, and this is their endpoints after 5 minutes of walking. You see a nice distribution of where they end up in after 5 minutes. And you will see that they don't escape the starting position by more than 100 meters. That's a modern prison that we have here. And of course, since it's a random process, what is happening is that the variance over time gets larger and larger and larger. That's simple drift parameters that you have in there. Okay, since it's a random process, there is also an argument against that humans have something like an inner compass or so, which certainly birds and other animals have, some magnetic sense or so. And it's always debated still in the literature whether humans have something like that. I think this is good arguments that we don't. Okay, so what is going on? Well, what we believe is happening is that if you really don't have any external sense, you have to trust your internal sense. And the only internal sense that tells you where straight ahead is basically your vestibular organ, which tells you, well, if I move here, straight ahead was here, now it's moved somehow. So you know only from your internal senses where straight ahead is and where you want to walk. But since a sensory organ, it's not perfect. And since a sensory organ which senses acceleration, in order to get a direction estimate, you have to integrate it. And if you integrate a noisy process, you get a random walk. Okay, so what does that do? Well, imagine you're here straight ahead. Your estimate of straight ahead is slightly shifted to the left, just by noise, coincidentally, here. If you do this, well, you walk one step slightly to the left. Now the next token of noise that you're getting, well, may drive you even more to the left by coincidence. You go in one step more. Next one maybe drive you back, and so on. If we take this simple model and put it in MATLAB and simulate what is happening with the whatever step length of like 75 centimeters, which humans usually have, noise parameters that we know from the vestibular organ, from simple measurements, that's the trajectories that come out. So a very simple model. Just noise in the vestibular system on your sense of where straight ahead is. What it is underlying here is a simple random walk process of what you think, what direction there is. So for example, it's exactly this curve. So here you start straight, that's here, then you're going to the left, that's this one. Then you're turning and you're staying down there by coincidence, since it's a random process. You're constantly turning in this direction. Here you're going more straight again, and then you're going back into circles. So because a random walk process has the tendency to drift off to one side or the other side, that makes you then run in a circle for quite some while. So it's no mystery whatsoever. Okay, so but now I want to come back to my recalibration story, whether people get recalibrated, because of course if you have no external information, then they only have the vestibular, which drifts away. But similar like an accelerometer or IMU or so does, if you let it run for a while. But if I allow them to see again, they should use the visual information to reset whatever there is, to basically recalibrate the state with a simple Kalman filter. That's what we do in technical system. We have a drift that runs off, and then we take another measurement and we recalibrate our drift in our accelerometer to do this. Luckily, we had here people walk on this, in this case, in an airstrip in an open field for quite some time, and we broke their walking after 5 minutes each. That's these red points here, but sometimes they were also leaving the field. That's these blue ones when we just grabbed them at the shoulder and turned them around again to the starting position. So we had two different kind of stop, namely this trial stop where they have vision available, and turns where they basically have only haptic information and us talking to them, guiding them back. Both of them, however, give them information on where straight ahead is. So after this pause, they should walk more straight. It's a prediction. So if I look at this correlation of the curvature they have before the pause and the difference in curvature before and after, if they completely recalibrate, you predict a negative correlation of -1. What you find is, well, for that, where they have vision available, very close to that, where they only have haptic information and us turning them, it's still recalibrated, but it's not perfect on a given trial. But of course, people are using additional information to reset their sensors again and to recalibrate them if they have accumulated any drift or any inaccuracy that they're having. So it's a pretty natural situation that we are having, like putting on these glasses, recalibrating. We have to recalibrate our sensors all the time. Okay. That's this. Probably, yeah, it's a summary of that. Probably quickly back to these anecdotes, because I still believe they are true. Even so, we didn't find circling behavior in the desert. But if we look at the situation that people had, these were people that were thinking about this camera team for over a year before we did the experiment. So they had all the time in the world to look at strategies that they could do. They knew there was someone walking behind them with water, who, in case they would faint or whatever, they would always be there. So I think if you do this in a realistic situation, you run out of water, getting into panic, you forget about all strategy and trust your senses, and that's when you start running in circles. So we didn't get permission to do this experiment, so it's still up and to do. But I'm pretty strongly believer that that's what would happen if we do that. Okay. Probably to the end, as you've seen, all these experiments are nice because they're done in the real world, but often they are quite difficult to control. Like we had the sandstorm there, whatever, there were bombs on the ground, and things like that, or the sun was not moving as we wanted it to move. So ideally, of course, I would like to do this all not in real world settings, but in controlled virtual environments. So one of the strategies that we use in my lab is that we try to replace this real environment, similar as you have seen for the haptic devices, with a virtual environment, and then do the experiment in a more controlled case. Here we have on the haptic side quite a number of projects, but probably the more interesting one for you here to look at is a project called CyberWalk that we started in 2005. It's ended now, a while ago actually. But that allows us to basically do locomotion studies in virtual reality. And what you need for that is, of course, a treadmill. But you need a treadmill which goes in all directions, not only in one. Otherwise, it would be boring. The first idea we had is actually a while ago that we wanted to build a treadmill like this. This should be roughly like 5 meters in diameter. It should have been made out of little balls. And these balls are driven by one big belt, and this belt is again sitting on a turntable, similar like here. So you have an array of balls sitting on a belt, and this belt can turn. This way, you can turn people around and always bring them to the center. And these colleagues of us in Munich who built this device, built us a first prototype of that design. Here you can see that supposedly a human walking in different direction, and if he walks in a different direction, the belt turns in that direction, brings him back to the center. So it works pretty nicely, that design. Of course, that's not the size of a human, even so a human can already sit on it. But it's not big enough. In order, you wanted to scale it up, of course, for a human to walk, ideally something like 4 by 4, 5 by 5 meters. The problems that occur when you do this is this design is not very good, because you don't want to have less balls underneath the feet, otherwise it's unstable. If you have big balls like this, you can't really walk on that. But these are already 5,000 balls or something like this. If you scale it up to this size that we want, it goes into millions. Each ball has a little bit of friction, so it simply wouldn't find a material that could survive this friction over a long time. You could, of course, put a little bearing around each, but that goes into the millions then as a cost to do that. So this guy who built this one had a much cleverer idea to build an omnidirectional treadmill, which looks like this. So basically it took normal treadmills, like industry belts that you can find, only relatively small, 50 centimeters in size, but took 25 of those and put them on like a big chain. So the chain is going in this direction and the belt is going in this direction. This way we have two motion which are orthogonal on one another, so you can do omnidirectional treadmill. And that's what it looks like. This setup is now still in tubing. I couldn't carry that, unfortunately. It weighs about 12 tons. But I'm going back there every now and then to try and do the experiments over there. It's the first treadmill that can now be used for perceptual studies. When you want to do locomotion studies or interactive, here you see Jan walking on the treadmill. He walks freely in any direction. The problem is it has to be that size. In principle, technically, of course, you could make it much smaller. But if you make it much smaller, it also has to react more quickly. If you react more quickly, it would feel like you're walking on ice because you never can put force on the ground. It has to be 4 meters so you can walk 1-2 steps before the treadmill starts moving. Ideally, you want to have the start of the moving below your human detection threshold. This is hard to achieve. If you want to do that, we are very sensitive on a little bit of acceleration. If the floor moves just a little bit, you're very sensitive. If you want to be below the detection threshold, you need something like 50 by 50 meters. This 4 by 4 meters is a good compromise because it's biomechanically so stable that you don't fall. Even so, this person has a harness here, but that's only for security, not for support. So yeah, overall, this is a nice design now that we can do all these locomotion studies, walking in circles and whatever we want in laboratory conditions. Okay, well, this brings me to the summary and the end of my talk. I started off telling you something about how we integrate information across the senses. That is done in a statistical optimal way in the humans, taking the variance of the signals into account in order to reduce uncertainty. The brain uses auxiliary signals and correlations to solve correspondence problem and then in order to see which signals to integrate. The perceptual system is adjusted to the statistics of the environment, and if they change, the person actually very quickly adapts to these. The learning rate with which people do depends, of course, on the quality of the feedback that you're getting, but also on how often you learn or how predictable the world is. We constantly keep the sensory systems calibrated under natural situations. We do this, so that's not something artifact of the laboratory that we do. Well, in order to do this, we use a lot of virtual reality techniques. I haven't shown you one example of that here. But probably one take-home message for the human, which probably for engineers is not so surprising, but if you look at biologists or psychologists, it's probably more surprising. In order to behave optimally, the brain needs some representation, not only of the signals itself, but of the quality of the signal, of the reliability, of all the statistics of the signals. If not, they couldn't use it probably. It's like a scientist who give a data point without an error bar, couldn't use it. So how, however, the brain learns these statistics, how it's estimating them online, and especially so quickly, we still don't know. Okay, with this, I have to acknowledge many people who worked in that. Ilya, who is here in the room, Vincent Hayward, I guess, who many of you know. We did a lot of the haptic stuff I haven't talked much about today. And of course, a lot of funding that went into that. And with this, thank you. And if there's questions.